welcome to Newsclick. We are going to see 40 years of emergency which was imposed under Indira Gandhi rule in 1975. Today we are going to discuss about it, and to discuss the issue we have with us Prabir Purkayastha, who was students of Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1975 and was arrested under MISA Act. Hello Prabir. You were arrested during the 1975 emergency. So what was the situation that time? What were your experiences for the period, that 1 year of period that you were in jail?
Let me start with the experiences of 1 year during emergency. What was it like in jail? Well, jail in India at the time was the only free space where you could say what you wanted. So in that sense, we were protected by the fact we were already in jail. So there was no threat to free speech for us. So in that sense, you could argue that wasn't such a bad place at that time, because rest of India was in jail as far as free speech was concerned, what they could do and what they could say, while we had, of course, the limitation that you couldn't go out, you could meet your family, friends and so on, but at least we had free speech. So that is on a lighter vein. I must also confess that, considering that we were students at that point of time, so generally we were not very regular in our lives. So jail was a very regular life. You had regular food at regular times. So in that sense, my health probably improved during that 1 year of jail. Also got to give us a lot of time to read books that we wanted to. I read through Capital at that point of time, and also meet and talk to different kinds of political persons. We had RSS people in jail with us. In fact, Arun Jaitley was in jail at that time, and we were in fact a part of the same ward. So you also got to meet a lot of different kinds of people. There was Vijay Pratap, who was a socialist, so we got to know him. Surendra Mohanji, who died about a few years back, he was in the same ward again. So you got to meet a diverse set of people with different views, and that was an interesting experience. The second question you had was, what led to the emergency? And I think that's a much bigger question. If we look at what was happening before that, which is why emergency gets declared, it was after 71, when Mrs. Gandhi had won an overwhelming victory, that within 2 to 3 years, that majority that she had got in parliament gets eroded on the ground. There are huge movements breaking out in different parts of the country in terms of corruption, in Gujarat it was an anti-reservation movement that took place. So you started to see the kind of centralized authoritarian rule that she had established within the Congress, by which there were no other centers of power within the Congress. That also had an effect that without the Congress, without her party, there were lots of forces which were then giving or articulating different kinds of views. So that was posing a threat in the coming elections, and it was quite possible that in the coming elections, therefore, all this would unite in a particular way, and Mrs. Gandhi or the Congress party then would not have a majority. So this was the shall we say, the larger picture. Of course, the proximate threat was she lost the case in Allahabad High Court. The judgment was she's not, her election was really not valid, and therefore whether she could continue as Prime Minister or not became a question, because she would not then be a Member of Parliament. So the proximate issue was really that.
Probably when you talk about Congress, JP movement led to emergency, and JP movement had also seen rise of various other political individuals which later formed into political parties like Lalu, Nitish. And so how has the political situation changed post emergency? If we see, like, a new government was formed after emergency, and later a coalition era also started in the Indian politics.
Again, the post-emergency situation, when you try to analyze it, the one issue that we have also to think about, why did she lift the emergency at all? Because by that point of time, a lot of the overground political resistance had actually been broken. The kind of initial movements where people came into the streets, did oppose, they were all people who were arrested, leaders were put in jail. The back of the resistance movement, at least apparently, had been broken. So it's an interesting question, and this is a question for which there are very few answers, that why did she at all lift emergency? Because a lot of people in jail at that time, including us, we believed that she would not lift emergency for quite some time. It would be 5 years, 10 years before we would see a change in Indian polity. And I think the reason is that she thought that she had been able to achieve what she wanted, break the people's back in terms of resistance, and they had accepted the emergency, and they had also accepted therefore the good of emergency, discipline, etc., etc. It's also interesting that North and South had very different reactions post-emergency. Let's not forget that the 4 southern states almost entirely voted for Mrs. Gandhi, and the northern states voted against her, and Maharashtra was half and half. I think overall terms there was a different reaction, partly because what are called the excesses of emergency are inherent in an authoritarian rule in which you impose emergency. So the local police officer, the local administrator is far more powerful than the political leaders of that part of the country, and much more powerful than the local leaders. So this was an inversion of what Indian democracy had stood for, where the social leaders, the political leaders on the ground had a certain kind of social power which is denied to them by administration becoming all powerful. So I think this part of it is the more important issue for me, really, that why people rejected the emergency, though as I said, middle class by and large was quite happy with the emergency. So this is, I think, an interesting issue, that why the emergency was lifted, because Mrs. Gandhi believed the middle class were with her, they appreciated the emergency, and therefore by and large the people would support the emergency rule, and therefore would vote her in again. And as you know, it became quite a big landslide. She lost by a huge margin, particularly in the northern states. Interestingly enough, the formations who come together, the Janata Party, and this was really the discussions going around in jail, and a lot of the people you identify as later leaders, they really come from the fact that they were seen as figures of resistance by virtue of being in jail, but also because of the JP movement. I would not say that it was the result of emergency they became leaders. I would say it was really the movements and the new figures who are emerging and who then find space in the political scheme of things. And in this, of course, emergency and the individual aura of those who are under maintenance of Internal Security Act, the visa, then does play a role.
Probably, if you look at the current situation, recently Lal Krishna Advani said that he cannot deny that emergency will again not take place. There are chances that it may take place again. So if you locate all these statements in the present context, in the way this current government is working, what do you think? Are there chances that this may again happen?
Well, there are two parts to the question again I would react in. One is, what will be the reaction of the people? So that's one part. And I think that's a very important one when you come to Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. Why did the Indian people bring her back in 89? Why did Indian people bring her back in 79 when they rejected her in 77? Within 2 years of the rejection, they brought her back, just a little more than 2 years. So I think the Indian people drew the conclusion that they had taught Mrs. Gandhi a lesson which she was not going to forget. Congress had been taught a lesson, the Congress would not forget that. And also the Indian people, including the middle class, in some sense, realized that an authoritarian state is not the best of things even for the middle class, because somebody who is a minor functionary in the government is far more powerful than even the elite in the country. So that was not a good lesson for the elite to learn, that authoritarian rule is not particularly nice for them as well. But that's a good lesson for the country to learn, that yes, if this kind of authoritarian leaderships, this kind of authoritarian regime, and the middle class is always hankered for a strong government. So that lesson for the middle class, I think, was important, including the larger polity. It's also important that the people in rural areas, the poor, have learned their lesson. They always come out and vote in even larger numbers. It's a middle class voting figures which have dropped. So the Indian people also realize the importance of a democracy, the importance of a vote, by which at least once in 5 years they can tell the leaders what they think. So I think this is a part of how the people would react to authoritarian rule today. Does this government have potential to become authoritarian? Well, the question is the reverse. Is it not already becoming authoritarian? That would really be the issue. And I think there are two significant issues over here. One is, like Mrs. Gandhi, there is a centralization of authority inside the party. So you can see that all other centers of power have been weakened, including Mr. Advani himself, who is no longer, though he's given some token Margdarshak Mandal post, but essentially he has been completely marginalized. So there is this one issue which makes clear that all the other figures inside the BJP are being increasingly marginalized, and Modi is assuming a kind of centralized authority which no other formation has had except Mrs. Gandhi's Congress in that period. So I think this is one part of it. The second part of it is his intolerance for ideas which are different from his, and it comes out in various ways. When he goes abroad and talks about how the pride of India has been restored only because he has won, and that includes his predecessor, including Mr. Vajpayee. So all of that is to be considered as something that India should not be proud of, that throwing out the British and having an independent India is not something India was proud of. So you can see that in his ideological framework, if people don't agree with him, they are somehow outside the pale, and he shows that in different ways. So yes, there is a threat to democracy in the sense the instincts of this government, and particularly the increasing the sole leader, does show that they are not interested in listening to others. The point is, will the Indian people accept it? Now, my argument would be, having learned the lesson of emergency, yes, for the middle class, that lesson has sort of become less, what shall we say, important. They've forgotten, that generation is not there, they've forgotten a part of the lesson. Every generation might need to learn about it again and again. But I think apart from the about this lapse of memory, as it were, I think the Indian people by and large do not accept that an authoritarian centralized state is good for them.
Probably it would be my last question, that media had a very important role to play in 1975. What's the role that media has to play today when we look around the mainstream media, which has been completely corporatized, and it's run by the corporate houses?
When you say media had a big role in 75, well, once emergency was declared, media had a completely servile role. In fact, apart from Kuldeep Nair and one or two people, I think it was Ramesh Thapar, Kuldeep Nair, you could count them on one finger of one hand. I don't think people really stood up to emergency in any serious sense. So the role of media was a completely negative one at that point. Will the media play the same role again? I think it's already playing that role. You can see increasingly the media not having the guts to give a different narrative from the one Modi is setting for the nation. You have to see it on the various things. Swachh Bharat campaign, which is a completely campaign of tokenism. If you talk about the Yoga Day, you really don't see any critical references to any of this. The fact that the Yoga Day started with Surya Namaskar, you know it's going to affect a section of the minorities. You also know that when you have Vedic shlokas connected to yoga, you are also making it as if it's a religious part of what you are doing. So there are various ways these things are being done, but I find very few critical voices within the media. And the saving grace today is that the media is much more heterogeneous than it was earlier. And secondly, the agenda for media is being set differently. Earlier, print media set what is news. It's a headline of the day which determined what news was. After 24/7 news channels, television came into the picture, the what is news is set by the what is being seen at the prime time news debates. That is what it used to be. Now actually social media started also setting what is the news, what will be discussed, and that's much more difficult to control. Initially BJP or Modi acolytes could do that, but increasingly that kind of control over social media is breaking. So you can see increasingly other voices coming in. So it may not be that easy for the state, an authoritarian state, to impose the kind of muzzling it did on the press, and the servile behavior of the press will not automatically suffocate news completely. So I think those are the positive elements today which you must take into account.
That's all the time we have for today, Prabir, and thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for watching Newsclick.